host Pooja Sarkar, and you're listening to the podcast from the bookshelves of Forbes India. Thank you so much for being a part of our journey, and also thank you so much, guys, for sending so much love for the last podcast with Asa Damodaran. Now, today I decided why don't we talk about something as important as jobs? We've seen that a lot of people in the formal economy, even in the tech gig economy, have been losing jobs. And then there is the informal economy, which constitutes the largest portion of employment for in our country. Where we have seen migrant workers going back home, construction companies, real estate developers, everybody is now concerned that when will this workforce come back. With all this in play, I just thought, why don't we talk about the importance of how to revive jobs at this point in time? There's a book called Reviving Jobs, and it has been edited by Professor Santosh Mehrotra, and it has a lot of these essays from other authors. Let's speak to him and understand how can we revive jobs in the country. First, I'll start with the existing problem in the Indian job market. Unemployment has risen from 2.2% in 2012 to 6.1% by 2018. What are the reasons for the same? And also, if you could explain your dual synergies model that you have described in the book and how that helps.
So there are two sets of reasons for this employment crisis. Let us remember that we were facing an employment crisis even before the pandemic. So we'll come back to the pandemic later, but the two reasons for the employment crisis prior to the pandemic were as follows. See, between 2004 and 2014, the economy was growing at 8% per annum on average, despite a global economic crisis in the middle. And I'll come back to that later. And because of this rapid growth, the economy was generating 7.5 million new non-agricultural jobs every year, when only 2 million people were joining the labor force. Now, but the economy slowed thereafter. So because the economy slowed thereafter, it was inevitable that it was going to generate fewer jobs. So that's the first reason. Now, let's just establish, first of all, that the economy was slowing after 2014. Now, for instance, compared to the 8% I mentioned for the period 2004 to 14, we find that the economic survey of 2019-20, in fact, of the government reports that the growth rate in 2014-15 was 7.5%. It was 8% in 15-16, which were two drought years. So it's a bit surprising that the growth rate was as high as that. And that is one reason why there have been question marks about the growth rate that the government has been announcing. And then the third year of the government, we found that there was a demonetization in late 16, and yet the highest growth rate for the last 6 years has been in the year of the demonetization. So even that is not so believable. Be that as it may, the point is, since 16-17, there's been the government's own claim about growth has been that it has slowed. It was 7.2% in 18-19, 17-18, sorry, and then 6.9 in 18-19, and much lower, 4.3 in 19-20. So the economy slowed and created fewer jobs than in the preceding 10-year period. The second reason is that the number of entrants to the labor force increased compared to earlier. What do I mean by that? You see, many millions of young people were in education and continued in education, but they were not going to remain in education forever. They were getting educated in order to get a job. So they started to enter the labor force. So while only 2 million people were joining the labor force between 2004-5 and 11-12, that number increased slowly to 5 million per annum. And these were all better educated people. And just when this larger labor force was entering and the labor market, looking for work, the number of jobs that began to be created after 2012 were much lower. So against the 7.5 million per annum in the period from 2004 to 11-12, only 2.9 million were being created. So you got unemployment rates as high as you rightly mentioned. In this context, we argue that there is a case for understanding the whole Indian economy through a dual synergies model. So, what is this dual synergies model? Let me sort of dwell on that initially. First, just say a few words sort of conceptually, and then I will spell out through examples as to what that conceptual dual synergy is. What is the first synergy? The first synergy states essentially, and this is essentially my own formulation. It states that separate interventions in health, in education, in nutrition, in water and sanitation, in fertility control and education, they complement each other, and thus they increase the impact that one intervention has on any other, through a feedback loop. So in other words, a better educated mother gives birth to children and looks after her children better, and those children learn better, and so on and so on. So I could go on giving many such examples, but I won't. And these interventions lead to a certain level of human capital or health and education indicators in any society. And that's a very important stock of human capital that India or any other country sort of inherits or develops. Now, the second synergy is between income poverty reduction and economic growth and this human capital, between this health and education level, income poverty, and economic growth. And essentially, the idea is that these three factors or policy objectives are extremely important in an interactive way, and they enable us to understand where any economy is, and particularly the Indian economy. So, what's the argument in the book? The argument in the book is the following: that the relationship between economic growth and poverty reduction is rather weak in the Indian economy. And there are many reasons for this, but the most important reason, from the point of view of reviving jobs, is that this relationship is mediated through job creation. When growth happens, if it happens with job creation, especially in the non-agricultural sector, it reduces poverty. So the point I'm making is that, India's growth in the past used to be quite slow, but it had improved until at least 2011-12. And that had resulted in new non-agri jobs. And unfortunately, the pattern of growth since then has been such that it has not generated so many jobs. And honestly, unless India actually invests in much more in health and much more in education than it has been doing, and now after the pandemic, even more so, it's a bit unlikely that we will be able to return to a growth rate that we had between 2004 and 14. And therefore, it's unlikely that we may be able to realize the demographic dividend. And that's a huge tragedy, because in 20 years, our demographic dividend will actually be over. We will become an aging society.
India's GDP growth for the March ending quarter has slowed to 3.1%, which is an 11-year low. While a lot of other economists have argued that it could have been far lower. This does not even include the pandemic period, because we saw that the pandemic period started towards March end, which basically means the coming quarter is going to be far worse. In this scenario, and with the kind of massive job loss news that we see everywhere, for example, it's part of the e-commerce and the tech economy, which is where a lot of the high-paying jobs were. People have seen massive amount of job losses happening that side. Migrant workers are going back home. What is really going to be the situation going forward?
Well, we were hoping that the stimulus package that the government will put in place will help to revive the economy. Unfortunately, the stimulus package that has been introduced by the government is rather weak. And I will explain this by comparison with the stimulus package which was put in place after 2008 global economic crisis. What the economy needs today is a revival in demand. And a revival in demand requires a fiscal stimulus. And this fiscal stimulus is only 1% of GDP compared to the 2008 fiscal stimulus, which was 4% of GDP, one fourth of what it was in 2008 when the crisis is much deeper. So, what is needed now, and which unfortunately only some part of it has been put in place? A, it is true that the government has increased money for Manrega for rural jobs because about 8 to 9 million migrant labor have migrated back to agriculture, and there's been an increase in the number of workers in agriculture, and wages are going to drop in agriculture because there are far too many. There were already far too many workers. There is even more workers now. So Manrega, the money has been increased, but the point is that the demand for Manrega will be perhaps much greater than the money allows. So normally in the past, we've seen that only about 50 person days per household of work is generated in Manrega. As soon as 100% days are utilized, I think the government may have to relax the 100 days cap. In other words, more money. Second part of the fiscal stimulus is that the government should think about an urban employment guarantee. What would be good about the urban employment guarantee? Many firms and many MSMEs in particular and construction sites will not revive without workers coming back, migrant workers coming back. An employment guarantee in the urban areas which actually attempt to encourage workers to come back, and it would be substitutive. So in the sense that, if workers come back, there'll be less demand for Manrega. The third thing that I believe that's absolutely essential that's needed is some cash transfer as a minimum income guarantee to poor households. There's a design available. I've shared it with the vice chairman of the Niti Aayog. It's absolutely critical that money is put in the hands of the poor. About 60% of rural households, 30% of urban households could be given this income guarantee. We have the infrastructure to do it. And there's no question of external demand reviving. We have to enhance domestic demand, and these three ways could actually do so. So if that happens, then all kinds of firms will begin to experience a revival of demand. And you see, we have to understand that the biggest job losses have been in the unorganized sector and much less so far in the organized sector, though you're right in stating that even organized sector is beginning to see losses. And you see, unless there is overall increase in demand, in aggregate demand, both organized and unorganized sector job losses will continue. And that would be tragic for our country.
So there's one thing that you talked about is the informal economy, which is a major portion. Now, coming to the informal economy of all the workers outside the agriculture, you state in the book that 84% are informal in the sense of lacking any social insurance. And what we are witnessing over the last 2 months is on how migrant workers were handled. What are these social policies that are required for the informal sector? Second, a lot of people have been talking about it, even though they are going back, and they will find it very difficult to come back before December 2020, or let's say even Jan or Feb 21. If that is the timeline, what are the kind of implications that we will see?
You see, there are 3 or 4 reasons why workers are not returning in a hurry. First, the pandemic is not only still with us, in fact, it is growing by leaps and bounds. And they know that they will risk their lives if they were to return too quickly. They already know that they live in very poor living conditions in urban areas, so they will be risking their lives because they will get infected. The second reason why they are unlikely to return quickly is that they know perfectly well that work sites, particularly construction sites and other small enterprises where they work, are not going to experience much demand, and therefore they will not need much labor. Thirdly, we must remember that they have left under conditions which have involved indignity and humiliation for them. Many of them have had to walk back. Many of them who finally been given trains from the 1st of May onwards are dying on the way. So this indignity has led to trauma, and I think they are unlikely to return very quickly. So, the economy is going to take a long time to revive. But one thing that should be done at this point, now it's absolutely critical that the government finally comes up with a very visionary social security code. And an ambitious plan is put in place, which would enable social security for all informal workers, and that's possible to do in three quick ways. Let me just say very briefly that all regular non-agricultural workers must be given EPFO coverage. Second, all the poor unorganized workers, they must be provided state-funded social insurance. So the government can actually afford this. I've costed this. It would cost no more than 0.65% of GDP, which is, not much more than what the government is spending on Manrega. And finally, those in between, those who are not poor and also not regular workers, they must be captured through a more contributory social insurance with some government contributions.
Just taking from here, I spoke to Mr. Thomas Piketty. He said that we need to get universal basic income. India really needs it at this point in time. This is the need of the hour. Something similar, Professor Abhijit Banerjee has been championing since last year. A lot of economists and professors have been saying that India does need at this point in time a universal basic income, but the government has clearly said that they wouldn't really like to give away handouts. Do you think at this point in time it is important to give away a universal basic income or a social security? And if yes, you talked about how it would only cost around 0.065% of the GDP. Then why is it that the government is not taking it seriously?
Okay, I don't think India can afford a universal basic income. But you recall at the very beginning of this interview, I talked about a minimum income guarantee, and this is my alternative to what Abhijit Banerjee and the Economic Survey had recommended. Let me explain. You see, we have an excellent socio-economic and caste census, which will enable us to identify the poor. Secondly, through the Jan Dhan accounts, we've managed to pretty much universalize bank accounts for the poor in our country. And thirdly, we have biometric identification of our population. And if you Aadhaar seeded the bank accounts, you can eliminate duplication. Now, what I would argue for is, as I said, a minimum income guarantee, which is much more inclusive than PM Kisan. The government already has PM Kisan, but the PM Kisan covers an extremely small group of rural people. It is meant only for owner cultivators. Even in rural areas, it does not include tenant farmers. It does not include the small and the landless labor. It doesn't include the poor non-farm worker. In urban areas, it doesn't include anyone. It doesn't include slum dwellers. It doesn't include other poor people who live outside of the slums. So that's why my design is actually such that this would be an additional 0.68% of GDP to that social insurance that I was talking about. And this would capture 95% of those people who are currently in PM Kisan and still include many more people. And it would be giving the same amount of money as PM Kisan does. The difference is that initially in the next 3 or 4 months, because people are in desperate need of cash, because nearly 120 million people are without jobs currently, particularly through April and may that has been the story. The amount that I would normally give is 500 rupees a month should be increased to these households to something like 3,000 to 5,000 rupees per month. This, my design would capture actually 70% of rural households. It would capture 30% of urban households. So I strongly would urge the government to think about this, because putting this in place is not going to be so difficult. It would actually generate rural demand and urban demand. And that's what we need today. If the MSMEs and other enterprises in the economy are going to revive. This is the worst economic crisis in the history of our country. And the actions that have to be taken have to be equally radical.
True. There is a chapter in the book on tackling jobless growth, the labor policy and labor codes. Now, in the wake of how states have been trying to bring in ordinances or trying to change labor laws across the country, we saw that, UP, Rajasthan, even Madhya Pradesh, everybody is now trying to increase work hours from 8 hours to 12 hours. Somebody's trying to let go of the Factories Act of 1948. I mean, how detrimental will this be for the informal sector workforce, and what are your views on that?
Okay, so let me make 3 or 4 points in this regard. A World Bank survey of organized sector enterprises in the country, and employers were asked the question, how important are labor laws as a constraint upon your growth and your economic activity? And they put labor laws as fourth in a ranking of constraints after electricity, the uh, the voltage, the lack of electricity. Second, corruption. Third, tax administration. Only then came labor law. So I'm not saying it is not a problem. Of course, it is a problem. But employers, the organized sector employers have learned how to get around those labor laws. Because if, for instance, there is a requirement that if I hire more than 100 workers, and then if I want to fire them, then I will have to get permission from the state government. So I don't even actually hire more than 100 workers. I just choose to hire contract workers who I can let go if and when I please. So, in other words, that doesn't serve the purpose of either the government or the workers, and the law is not being implemented. So, what state governments are attempting to do of let's do away all the labor laws, it's not going to invite investment in them. Point one. As I'm saying, labor laws are a problem, and this is my second point. One particular law I have just mentioned, which is the Industrial Disputes Act, Chapter 5B, which talks about that 100 worker threshold, where if you have more than 100 workers, you want to fire them, then you have to get the state government's permission. Is something, this clause and this particular dimension of the Industrial Disputes Act can be taken care of very easily, because the Second National Labour Commission had actually recommended that the problem with this with this clause is the following: that it allows for only 2 weeks of pay for every year worked. If you're fired, then the employer is supposed to pay only 2 years of salary for every year that you work. Now, this 2 weeks is really way too little, and it had recommended that it should be 6 weeks. So that can be implemented. If that can be implemented, and it seems that there is an agreement between workers as well as employers, then this can be done away with. No, thirdly, I want to say the government the central government has done a good job in sort of bringing 35 labor laws into 4 codes. But what is important at this stage is that the central government should not hurry them. More consultation is needed. And particularly, then there are states which also have labor laws, and I think they have to reform them. And finally, if government is serious about implementing labor laws, then we cannot have merely 3,000 labor inspectors in a country as vast as ours with a workforce 465 million. So in other words, there is much that needs to be done But the kind of actions that have recently been taken by state governments are not going to be terribly helpful.
Cool. And so before I let you go, the final question being a very simple question. It's the name of the book, Reviving Jobs. How will the country revive jobs? More so in these times.
Let me make one big uh, uh, ticket recommendation. You know, this ours is a country which has not managed to grow our manufacturing sector. Manufacturing has not been a lead sector in our economy. It has not been the sector which drives growth. Manufacturing, please note, accounted for 17% of GDP in 1991. It still is 17%. Manufacturing accounted for about 11% of total employment in our workforce. It still is 11.5%. This is an unacceptable situation. So therefore, India has to focus on manufacturing. And there are in the book there is it's spelled out what could be the components of a manufacturing strategy in the country. And let me just very briefly, if I may, sort of mention to you what those components of a manufacturing strategy have to be, which would enable manufacturing jobs to come up. Firstly, I argue in the book for a horizontal or cross sectoral manufacturing strategy which is aligned to trade policy. What do I mean by aligned to trade policy? Trouble is, we reduced our tariffs very rapidly after 1991. And yes, we enabled imports to come in, which started being used for manufacturing domestically. But unfortunately, those imports also destroyed our own manufacturing. Therefore, it's critical, something which emerged through the free trade area agreements called the inverted duty structure needs to be corrected because it has led to negative effective rates of protection. Point one. Point two, we've allowed in the last 5 or 6 years our real effective exchange rate to, you see, our inflation rate is higher than the inflation rate in our competitor countries, which means that our imports are cheaper, therefore our markets are full of imports, and our exports become more expensive, and that's no good for the manufacturers within our country. So we have to allow our real effective exchange rate to actually depreciate. It has to depreciate. The third thing, one of the reasons manufacturing employment fell was because the five sectors which account for 50% of manufacturing employment, they were the ones which saw the job losses. So what were those sectors? Textiles, garments and apparel, wood and furniture, leather and footwear, and food processing. Now, these are highly labor intensive sectors, and these sectors need packages, policy packages, which I talk about in the book. Don't have the time to discuss it. Third, most of our MSMEs are located in clusters around the country. Now, there are 5,500 clusters across the whole country of manufacturing. Some of them are modern industry clusters, there are handloom, handicraft, etc. And our cluster development programs need much better funding and much more integrated approach at the local level. Fifth, I think we are a country which has managed to educate its young people, but vocational education is of very poor quality. Vocational training is not imparted to our young people, and it's critical that vocational education and training be imparted near the clusters so that young people who are getting educated in rural areas actually get trained near the clusters and that get employment. In other words, if the training was taking place near where the jobs are, that would be great. Another component, we need to strengthen the urban infrastructure in our small and medium sized towns in particular, because that's where these clusters are located. We are not a country which sort of designs products on its own and creates them and manufactures them and then sells them to the rest of the world. Design capacity in enterprises, and finally, uh, innovation can be encouraged if private corporates were to invest more in R&D, and the government needs to incentivize that, because we know that private investment in R&D is much more effective. So in other words, innovation, and then enabling a startup environment. In other words, enabling this kind of innovation to lead to startups and mass entrepreneurship. This is the way forward. That means there's a whole panoply of policies that will have to be part of this industrial policy, industrial strategy. And without such an industrial strategy, that I don't think we can begin to become a $5 trillion economy for a long time to come.
That's quite interesting. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being on the podcast.